He said he didn't want kids, but 3 years later, he saw a little girl with his eyes, and her mother was the woman he thought he'd forgotten. Lillian Casanova had always believed that happiness didn't need to be loud to be real. It lived in small rituals, the warmth of morning coffee held between her palms, the comfort of old movies that played like lullabies, and the quiet safety of shops where no one rushed and the world felt softer for a moment. She never asked for much, and for a long time she thought that simplicity would be enough. But everything changed the moment Aaron Hale walked into her life, a man whose presence rewrote the meaning of every ordinary day and reshaped her understanding of love in ways she wasn't prepared for. He was unlike anyone she had ever known, gold-haired, sharp-jawed, brilliant, and terrifyingly driven, with eyes the color of a frozen ocean. He belonged to a world of power, wealth, and expectations that could crush a weaker person, yet he had a charm that made even the most guarded soul lean toward him. When he smiled, the world felt brighter. When he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that was almost dangerous. They met at a charity expo, an event she attended only because her friend forced her to escape her routine for once. He approached her not because she stood out, she didn't, but because in that moment she was the only person in the room who wasn't trying to impress him. That intrigued him. That was how it began. Their relationship grew in stolen moments, late-night walks through hidden streets, quiet dinners where he let himself be human instead of a corporate heir, mornings when he pulled her close as if afraid she would vanish. But there was always something trembling underneath it all, an unspoken divide that neither of them dared acknowledge out loud. For him, emotions were a risk; for her, they were the only truth that mattered. She loved him with a softness that terrified her, and he loved her in a way he refused to admit even to himself. The turning point came on a night that should have been simple. They were in his luxurious apartment on the 30th floor, surrounded by city lights that shimmered like distant stars. He had spent the day in back-to-back meetings, battered by shareholders and family demands, and by the time he walked through the door he carried the sharp, brittle edge of someone who had been pushed too far. She tried to ease the tension, cooking his favorite dinner, touching his shoulder lightly, asking him how he felt, but instead of letting her in, he lashed out. Not with anger, but with carelessness. "I don't want kids," he muttered as he set his glass down harder than necessary. "Ever. I'm not built for that, Lillian. I'm not sacrificing my life to become someone's father. I don't want the responsibility. I don't need it." The words spilled from him not as a confession, but as a dismissal, one he didn't even think twice about. But for her, something inside cracked at the sound of them. She felt her chest tighten, and though she tried to keep her expression steady, she could feel a tremor beneath her skin. He didn't notice. He didn't see how the light left her eyes or how her fingers curled into her palms to anchor herself. In that moment, she realized that the path he wanted and the life she dreamed of were no longer running parallel. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. Instead, she stood quietly, walked to the door, and picked up her coat. His confusion came too late. By the time he reached for her, she had already stepped out of the apartment with a calmness that came not from peace, but from heartbreak so deep she couldn't even feel it fully. 2 weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant. The test lay in her shaking hands as she sat on the floor of her small bathroom, staring at the 2 unmistakable lines through a mist of tears. She wanted to tell him. God, she wanted to call him so badly, to say that life had made the choice for them, that maybe he would change his mind if he knew. But every time she remembered the cold certainty in his voice, "I don't want kids," she placed the phone down again. She chose to raise her daughter alone. She worked double shifts, took freelance projects, slept little, and fought through every fear that came with motherhood. When the contractions tore through her, she was alone. When she held the tiny girl against her chest for the first time, she whispered her name, Scarlett, and promised never to let her feel unwanted. Scarlett grew into a bright, joyful child with soft blonde curls and brilliant blue eyes that mirrored his so perfectly it sometimes stole Lillian's breath. 3 years passed like a blur of exhaustion, laughter, and sacrifice. Lillian found a rhythm that kept her going, even when the nights were long and the worries endless. Meanwhile, Aaron lived a life sculpted by ambition. He expanded his corporation, traveled relentlessly, attended galas with women who smiled too perfectly, and convinced himself that success was enough to fill the silence in his penthouse. But no matter how bright his achievements became, the emptiness grew darker. He felt it in the quiet after the boardrooms emptied, in the echo of footsteps in his oversized home, in the way he sometimes woke at night with a heaviness he couldn't name. All of that changed on an ordinary afternoon when he stepped into a supermarket, a place he never visited unless it was unavoidable. The security system in his mansion was being repaired, the concierge was unavailable, and he decided to stop by for a quick purchase. He didn't expect anything unusual. He didn't expect anything at all. But as he turned the corner near the cereal aisle, he saw a little girl standing on her toes, trying to reach a brightly colored box. She had golden hair that fell in soft curls and eyes so vivid, so undeniably blue, that for a moment he forgot how to breathe. Those eyes were his. The shape, the color, the spark, everything. She looked up at him, and when their gazes met, she smiled with a sweetness that hit him like a physical blow. And in that instant, the life he thought he understood collapsed beneath him. A week passed after their unexpected meeting in the supermarket, yet neither A nor Lillian could escape the echo of that moment. For him, everything that once seemed stable now felt shaken, as if the polished world he had built had suddenly revealed its cracks. He went back to his penthouse and found it unbearably silent. The marble floors, the expensive art, the perfect order of every room, none of it brought him comfort. He sat in the living room long after midnight, hearing again the small voice of the girl in the aisle, remembering the shape of her smile, the soft curve of her cheek, the shade of her hair that matched his own childhood photos so precisely that it almost frightened him. He tried to work the next morning, burying himself in reports and contracts, but every line blurred with the memory of the way Lillian had looked at him. She hadn't screamed, hadn't accused, hadn't demanded anything. Instead, she had spoken with quiet strength, each word hitting him with twice the force because of that calm. He had wounded her deeply, and now, years too late, he finally understood how much those careless words had cost. Lillian, meanwhile, struggled to steady herself after the encounter. She had gone home with shaking hands, clutching Scarlett a little tighter than usual. Her apartment was small but warm, filled with the soft chaos of a life lived simply, children's books on shelves, tiny socks in laundry baskets, crayons forgotten on the coffee table. She sat on the floor with Scarlett that evening, watching the child draw messy circles in bright colors, and tried to breathe through the flood of emotions that had been waiting in the shadows for years. She had built her life carefully, learning to exist without the man who had once unintentionally broken her heart. Now he had suddenly reappeared, with shocked eyes and a voice that trembled when he asked the question she feared most. She had said the truth aloud, that Scarlett was his, and the weight of those words still trembled inside her. She didn't regret telling him, not exactly, but she feared what would follow. A man like him lived in a world she could never belong to. Wealth, power, cameras, long hours, expectations. She didn't want her daughter dragged into that world. Yet she also couldn't ignore the fact that Scarlett had looked at him with an ease that felt almost instinctive. A few days later, Lillian found herself thinking about him more than she wanted to admit. Not because she longed for him, but because the idea of him knowing about Scarlett opened a door she wasn't prepared to walk through. How much could he change? Could he adapt to a life that wasn't shined and polished, where love was messy and unpredictable? She remembered him from years ago, brilliant, charming, distant, terrified of anything that kept him from maintaining control. But he had looked different now, shaken, softer somehow, like a man who had discovered that all his success meant nothing in the absence of something real. Still, she was not naive enough to let that soften her caution. It couldn't stand the uncertainty gnawing at him. He found himself driving the same route past the supermarket several times, hoping to see them again. He hated feeling helpless, but he also knew he had no right to demand more than she was willing to offer. For 3 years, he had lived without realizing that a part of his soul existed outside him, walking around with small steps and bright eyes. The knowledge left him breathless. He began reviewing old memories, wondering how he could have been so careless, so consumed by ambition that he had pushed away the only woman who had ever given him something real. He replayed the night he said those words, "I don't want children," and felt a wave of shame so deep it clawed at him. He had said it without thinking, without considering how it might crush someone whose heart was gentle, hopeful, and far more vulnerable than he had realized. 3 days after their meeting, fate intervened sooner than either expected. Lillian was checking out at the same store, pushing a cart with Scarlett half asleep in the child's seat, when she looked up and saw him again. He stood at the far end of the aisle, as if he'd just turned and stumbled into her. Their eyes locked, and she felt her heart twist painfully. He walked slowly toward them, careful, almost hesitant, as though approaching something fragile he feared might break if he moved too fast. Scarlett blinked sleepily, then looked at him with a curious smile. She stretched her arms toward him without a word. Lillian froze. A.'s breath caught. He glanced at Lillian first, silently asking permission. She hesitated but eventually nodded, unable to deny the connection her daughter clearly felt. He picked Scarlett up, holding her against his chest. The tiny girl settled comfortably into his arms, touching the collar of his shirt, her fingers playing with the button. The world seemed to narrow into that single moment, this impossibly beautiful child, so trusting, resting her head on the shoulder of a man who had once sworn he wanted no children at all. Lillian watched him with a complex mix of fear and something softer. He held Scarlett as if she were the most precious thing he had ever touched, his breath unsteady, his expression raw and open in a way she had never seen before. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "I don't know how to make this right," he whispered, almost to himself. "But please, let me try." The plea lingered in the space between them, fragile and uncertain. Lillian didn't answer immediately. She wasn't ready to trust him, and yet she wasn't ready to shut him out. Not when he held her daughter with such trembling reverence. Not when Scarlett, with her small hands and bright innocence, looked at him like she had known him all her life. And so, without fully meaning to, Lillian let the first thread of possibility tie itself between them, thin, delicate, but real. She didn't know what would come next, or whether her heart could survive another break. But for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't finished. Lillian spent the first week after seeing Aaron again in a strange, heavy haze, as if her mind were trying to process too many emotions at once and failing at all of them. She had always imagined that if their paths ever crossed again, she would be prepared, stronger, untouchable. But the truth was much messier. Seeing him in the supermarket had torn open a part of her heart she had carefully stitched shut years ago. It wasn't just the shock of meeting him again, it was the way he had looked at Scarlett, the raw, unmistakable recognition in his eyes, and the tremor in his voice when he whispered her name. She kept replaying the moment, unable to decide whether it frightened her or hurt her more. She spent her days working long shifts at the small boutique bakery where she had found a job after her maternity leave, carrying trays of pastries through warm air scented with caramel and vanilla. Regular customers greeted her with the tenderness that comes from seeing someone's life unfold day by day, and no one imagined the storm that had begun inside her. At home, Scarlett filled every silent corner with her sunshine. She danced through the living room with ribbons in her hair, sang little made-up songs while drawing on scraps of paper, and climbed into her mother's lap every chance she got. Lillian had built her world around her daughter, every piece of herself reshaped to fit the fragile miracle that had arrived 3 years earlier. And now her world was shifting again, whether she wanted it to or not. Scarlett had noticed the tension almost immediately. Children sensed these things instinctively. She followed Lillian around the apartment, sometimes quiet, sometimes overly affectionate, as if she could feel the heaviness her mother tried to hide. One evening, while Lillian was washing dishes, Scarlett climbed onto the counter and wrapped her tiny arms around her mother's neck. "Mommy, your heart feels sad," she whispered. The words sliced through Lillian like a blade made of truth. She stopped, turned, and hugged her daughter so tightly that Scarlett giggled. Lillian forced a smile. "My heart is just thinking, sweetheart," she murmured, though the truth was that her heart was trapped in a war between fear and hope. She didn't want Scarlett to grow up in the shadow of men who came and went, who spoke carelessly and left deeper wounds than they ever realized. She had promised herself that her daughter would never feel unwanted the way she had felt the moment Aaron said he didn't want children. She remembered everything about that day, his frustration, his cold tone, the way he dismissed the idea of responsibility as if it were a burden beneath him. She remembered standing in his living room, clutching her purse, feeling like she was shrinking smaller and smaller as he insisted he wasn't ready to ruin his freedom. She remembered walking away without looking back because the alternative was breaking right in front of him. But now he knew. And he wasn't the same. She had seen fear in his eyes, not the arrogant fear of commitment, but a deep, aching fear of having lost something precious. She couldn't forget the way his hands trembled when he asked, "Is she mine?" She had wanted to lie, to protect the life she had built. But she couldn't. She had looked into his eyes and told him the truth, and the truth had changed everything. Over the next days, he tried to call. She ignored every attempt. It wasn't anger, it was self-preservation. She needed time to breathe, to think, to decide what was right for Scarlett, not for her wounded pride. At night, when the apartment grew quiet and Scarlett's soft breathing filled the room, Lillian sat by the window with a cup of tea clasped in cold hands. She replayed every moment of her past with Aaron, both the tenderness and the cruelty, trying to understand whether the man she saw in the supermarket was the same man who had once broken her. She hated how much she remembered about him. The way he used to trace circles on her back when she fell asleep on his couch, the way he laughed when she joked about his designer suits, the way he whispered her name when he kissed her. These memories had once been everything. After she left, they had become nothing more than ghosts. But seeing him again had made them feel alive, and that scared her more than anything. 3 nights after their encounter, Lillian dreamed of the past. In the dream, she was standing in Aaron's penthouse again, the city stretching out below them like a field of stars. She felt his warmth behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. She turned to face him, expecting to see the man who had said he didn't want children, but instead she saw the man from the supermarket, frantic, broken, and desperate. He whispered, "Please don't disappear again." She woke with tears wetting her pillow. She tried to bury the dream, but it followed her the next morning, lingering under her skin as she got Scarlett dressed and carried her downstairs into the fresh air. The day was bright, the sky a gentle blue that reminded Lillian of her daughter's eyes. Scarlett pointed at birds, dragged her tiny stuffed rabbit across the pavement, and insisted on smelling every flower they passed. The simplicity of the moment grounded Lillian, reminding her of why she had survived everything she had endured. Yet even as she smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm, she felt a familiar tension rising. She knew she couldn't ignore Aaron forever. He would try again. And when he did, she needed to be ready, not just as a mother, but as a woman who had once loved him deeply and had been hurt just as deeply. She needed to decide whether the door she had closed 3 years ago should stay sealed or whether it was meant to open again for someone who might finally understand what it meant to stay. But for now, she took Scarlett's hand and walked forward, letting the little girl lead her through the sunlight. The world was uncertain, but her daughter's small fingers felt solid and warm, grounding her to the present. And as they turned the corner toward their building, Lillian whispered to herself the truth she wasn't ready to say aloud: she hoped Aaron wouldn't give up. He didn't expect the exhaustion to hit him so quickly. It surprised him how deeply the past could reach into the present, wrapping around his throat and forcing him to breathe memories he thought he had buried. The days after seeing Lillian and the little girl became a blur of spiraling thoughts, relentless guilt, and flashes of a future he thought he had permanently closed himself off from. He kept replaying the moment in the store, the surreal shock of seeing a tiny blonde child stare up at him with the exact same crystalline shade of blue that stared back at him in the mirror every morning. The recognition had crashed into him like a tidal wave, dragging him under before he could even comprehend what was happening. He tried to function as usual, attending board meetings, reviewing financial reports, signing contracts, and nodding at investors, but everything felt hollow, like he was acting inside a glass box where sound could not escape. His mind drifted constantly, returning again and again to that small aisle between shelves of cereal boxes where the simple truth of his past choices had stood before him in the form of a child who had no idea who he was. He couldn't escape the image of Lillian standing protectively behind her daughter, the quiet strength in her posture, the steady calm in her eyes, even as shock flickered through them like a crack in porcelain. At night he found himself pacing around his penthouse, unable to sit still, unable to sleep. He would touch the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows and watch the city lights tremble below him, remembering Lillian's laughter, her warmth, the way she would wrinkle her nose when she concentrated on something. He had pushed all of that away because he thought he was doing the right thing for himself, because the idea of responsibility terrified him, because his parents had drilled into him that a family was a trap, an anchor, a vulnerability. Those words had shaped him so deeply he hadn't even questioned them, until now, when he saw what he had turned away from. He remembered the night he had said the words that changed everything, "I don't want children," spoken carelessly, arrogantly, with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed emotions were weaknesses and independence was strength. He hadn't meant to hurt her, in truth, he hadn't even been thinking of her feelings at all. He had been thinking only of himself, his freedom, his future, his carefully planned life. He had watched her inhale, watched a shadow pass through her gaze, but he hadn't understood what it meant. He had let her leave without asking why her hands trembled or why her smile didn't reach her eyes. Now he knew the truth, he hadn't just lost a woman he could have loved, he had lost years of a daughter's life he hadn't even known existed. The guilt scratched at him until he could barely sit still. He thought about what Lillian must have endured, pregnancy alone, nights alone, a birth alone, raising a child without anyone to lean on. He imagined her walking floors at night with a crying newborn, exhausted and frightened, while he was somewhere across the city signing deals and sipping aged whiskey in tailored suits. He imagined her watching the first steps, hearing the first words, celebrating birthdays with only a small cake and quiet hopes. And he wasn't there. He hadn't even known. Not because she hid it from him, but because he had made sure she had no reason to stay. He tried to tell himself she should have told him anyway. But every time he tried to cling to that thought, it dissolved. He remembered her standing in his apartment doorway after he said those words, too proud to beg, too heartbroken to speak. He had built the wall. She had simply walked away from it. The next morning he sat in his office with papers spread before him, reading the same sentence 3 times without processing it. His assistant asked a question he didn't hear, and he dismissed her with a distracted wave. He couldn't focus. His mind was already at that supermarket, imagining Lillian buying groceries, imagining the little girl tugging at her sleeve, imagining how ordinary and real their life must be, everything he had never allowed himself to consider wanting. By midday he closed his laptop and left the building without telling anyone where he was going. He found himself driving with no destination, letting instinct guide him, his hands tight on the steering wheel. He didn't know what he would say when he saw Lillian again. He didn't know how to explain 3 years of absence. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: if he walked away now, if he ignored what he had seen, he would never forgive himself. For the first time in his life, fear didn't make him run, it forced him to face everything he had been avoiding. He drove past neighborhoods he had never noticed, past parks where families played, past small shops where people lived quieter and fuller lives than he had ever understood. And somewhere in that unfamiliar landscape, a realization began to bloom, painful but necessary. He didn't want the life he had built anymore. He wanted something real. Something that mattered. Someone who mattered. And she had been right in front of him all along, carrying a piece of him in her arms. As evening approached, he stopped the car near the supermarket where everything had changed. He sat in silence, watching the automatic doors slide open and shut, feeling the old version of himself crumble piece by piece. He didn't know how to fix the damage he'd caused, but he knew this time he wouldn't run from it. Not again. Not ever. The days after Scarlett's night in the hospital changed something fundamental between them, although neither dared to say it out loud. Aaron found himself thinking not about mergers or board meetings, but about the quiet tremor in Lily's voice when she had called him, the way she had clung to the sleeve of his jacket while the doctors worked, the way Scarlett had curled into his chest as if she had always belonged there. Every second of that night replayed in his mind with a clarity that made it almost painful, yet he welcomed the ache because it reminded him he was finally feeling something real again. He had spent years living a life crafted from polished detachment, an immaculate penthouse, immaculate schedule, immaculate distance from anything that could hurt him. But now that distance felt childish and cold, and he found himself wanting to trade every one of his trophies for another moment of Scarlett sleeping in his arms or Lily looking at him without fear. Lily tried to pretend that nothing changed, but she was a terrible liar when it came to her heart. She kept repeating to herself that letting Aaron into their world was temporary, that Scarlett's bond with him didn't mean hers had to reform too, but every time he knocked on her door with soup or new crayons or a shy, lopsided smile, it became harder to maintain the walls she had so carefully rebuilt. She watched him teach Scarlett how to stack wooden blocks, watched him crawl on the floor with her as if the expensive suit he had been wearing didn't matter, watched him pick leaves from her hair after she ran through the park, and with every small gesture something inside her softened even though it frightened her to her core. One night, when she thought he wasn't looking, she caught him staring at Scarlett with an expression so full of gratitude and fear that it took her breath away, as though he still couldn't believe he'd been given this second chance and was terrified he might lose it. He began carving out space in his schedule with a determination that shocked even his assistant. Aaron would leave work early without explanation, cancel dinners with investors, and show up at Lily's door with a quiet apology for arriving late, even if he was right on time. He didn't try to impress her with gifts or promises. Instead, he learned Scarlett's bedtime routine by heart, discovered which foods she disliked, memorized the names of all her stuffed animals. Lily watched him taking in their world with the cautious awe of someone who knew he didn't deserve it but wanted desperately to earn a place anyway. She saw the way Scarlett lit up around him and how he lit up around her, and it scared her because happiness born from pain always feels fragile, as if the slightest touch might shatter it. One cold evening, long after Scarlett had fallen asleep, Lily found Aaron sitting on the small bench outside her building. He wasn't dressed for the weather, but he didn't seem to notice the chill. His elbows rested on his knees, hands clasped, head lowered in a way she had never seen. When she stepped outside, he lifted his gaze. There was no arrogance in his expression now, only exhaustion and something almost vulnerable. He started to speak but stopped, searching for words that didn't sound rehearsed. Finally he admitted that he felt lost most days, unsure how to undo the damage he'd once caused, unsure how to build something new without breaking it again. He confessed that every time Scarlett reached for him, he felt both grateful and terrified, afraid he would fail her the way he had failed Lily. She sat beside him, not touching, simply listening. The snow fell lightly around them, soft and soundless. Lily had spent years convincing herself that the man she once loved had died inside the cold billionaire the world admired. But sitting here, seeing him stripped of every shield he once used, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to consider. He hadn't been heartless, he had been afraid, shaped by a life where love was treated as weakness, where expectations were heavier than affection. It didn't excuse the hurt, but it explained the brokenness they now shared. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Lily said something she hadn't planned to reveal, something that had lived inside her chest for years, that raising Scarlett alone had been the hardest and most beautiful journey of her life, but sometimes she lay awake at night wondering whether her daughter would ever know the other half of herself. She admitted that even through anger, even through heartbreak, she had always hoped he would grow into the man she believed he could be. Aaron inhaled sharply at that, as if the weight of her quiet faith was almost too heavy to bear. The conversation didn't end with reconciliation or grand declarations. It ended with a small offering of honesty, fragile and trembling like a seed pushing through frozen ground. Lily stood to go inside, and Aaron rose too, but before he stepped away he whispered that he would wait as long as it took, for trust, for forgiveness, for a place in their world that he wouldn't take for granted again. She didn't promise him anything, but she didn't close the door either. She simply nodded, and he understood more from that one gesture than from any words she could have spoken. That night, after she returned to Scarlett's room and tucked the blankets around her daughter's small form, Lily lingered for a moment at the doorway. Scarlett murmured in her sleep and curled closer to the stuffed rabbit Aaron had bought her during their first visit to the toy store together. Lily watched her for a long time, feeling the quiet shift inside her heart. She wasn't ready to love him again, not yet, but the bitterness was melting, giving way to something gentler. Something dangerous. Something hopeful. Outside, Aaron stood beneath the street lamp, watching the apartment window until the lights dimmed. He didn't feel the cold, only the faint warmth of the possibility that, for the first time in years, he was moving toward the life he should have built in the beginning. Not through force, not through promises, but through patience and the simple, steady act of showing up. And though Lily didn't know it yet, he had already decided he would spend every day proving that the man who once pushed her away was gone, and that the father and partner he could become was worth believing in. He didn't expect the shift to happen slowly, almost invisibly, like snow melting from rooftops one warm morning at a time. After the night in the hospital when Scarlett clung to him as if she had always known him, something inside Aaron changed in a way he couldn't reverse, even if he wanted to. He became someone who woke up earlier not to check emails but to check messages from Lillian asking if Scarlett had slept well. He became someone who left meetings halfway through because he remembered that he had promised to pick Scarlett up from daycare and didn't want to disappoint her. His life, once filled with boardrooms, stock projections, and carefully measured conversations, slowly transformed into something softer and infinitely more complicated. He found himself walking through toy aisles instead of luxury boutiques, reading children's books instead of market reports, learning patience in ways no business negotiation had ever taught him. At first he felt like an outsider in their quiet, messy little world. Breakfast at Lillian's place often happened with cartoons playing in the background, with Scarlett dropping cereal on his shoes and Lillian tying her hair into a loose, crooked bun while rushing around the kitchen. He wasn't used to it. The noise, the unpredictability, the small hands tugging at his sleeves, the way Lillian laughed softly under her breath when Scarlett insisted that he sit next to her or help her pick a dress for the day, it was all unfamiliar, chaotic, and completely disarming. He had never realized how empty his penthouse was until he began spending his mornings in their cramped apartment smelling of vanilla candles and children's crayons. He watched Lillian with new eyes. She was strong in ways he couldn't define, forged not by comfort but by necessity. She balanced bills, schedules, work shifts, and motherhood with a quiet courage that humbled him. She wasn't the insecure girl he'd pushed away years ago, she had become a woman who carried tenderness and steel in equal measure. Sometimes he caught her looking at him when she thought he didn't notice, her eyes cautious but not cold, as if she were trying to understand who he had become and whether she could trust any part of him. He didn't push her, even when he wanted to reach for her hand or tell her that he lay awake at night thinking not only about his daughter but also about her, about the life they might have had if he hadn't been so blind. One evening he arrived earlier than usual. Lillian was helping Scarlett paint with watercolors at the small dining table, the room bathed in warm golden light from the setting sun. Scarlett immediately ran to him, lifting her arms, demanding to be picked up. He lifted her easily, breathing in the faint scent of strawberries in her hair. Lillian watched them quietly, her expression softer than he had ever seen. She didn't try to hide the warmth this time. Instead she simply returned to the table, leaving him space to join them if he wished. And he wished. He sat beside them, letting Scarlett paint on his sleeve, letting her chatter non-stop about her imaginary friends and the dreams she'd had the night before. Lillian laughed when he pretended to be horrified by the idea of a talking bear living under her bed. The room felt full, alive, like something he had been missing his entire adult life without knowing it. Later, after Scarlett fell asleep on the couch with her paint-stained fingers curled into tiny fists, Lillian covered her with a blanket. Aaron stood beside her, both of them watching the little girl breathe in soft, steady rhythms. For a moment the quiet wrapped around them so tightly it felt like an entirely different world, one where hurt and distance didn't exist, where they were simply two parents watching their child sleep. Lillian spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's grown so fast," she said, brushing a curl from Scarlett's forehead. "Sometimes I feel like I blink, and she changes overnight." He nodded, swallowing the ache that rose in his chest. "I wish I had been there for it," he said, not expecting anything in return. "I wish I could take back every moment I missed." Her posture softened, just slightly. She didn't forgive him, not fully, but she didn't pull away either. "You're here now," she murmured. "That matters too." He turned to her, wanting to say something, anything, and froze when he saw the faint tremble in her lip, the hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't only afraid of him hurting Scarlett. She was afraid of him hurting her again. He stepped back, giving her space. "Lillian, I don't want to disrupt your life. I don't want to rush anything. I just want to be someone you can trust, even if it takes years." She didn't respond right away, but she didn't shut the door on the conversation either. They continued talking quietly about small things, the pediatrician, the daycare schedule, her work shifts. Nothing important, yet somehow everything important. When he finally left that night, he looked back at the apartment door long after it closed, feeling something inside him settle into place. Life continued like this, a slow, delicate rebuilding. Some days Scarlett clung to him like he had always been her father. Other days Lillian kept her distance, guarded, thoughtful. But he never gave up. He learned not to fill silence with apologies, but with presence. He made space for their routines, for their fears, for their laughter. And little by little, the walls between him and Lillian began to crack, not with force, but with moments of trust so small he almost missed them. When she called him first during a stressful day. When she let him read Scarlett a bedtime story while she washed dishes. When she smiled at him one morning, tired but genuine, as if acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, he was becoming someone she didn't need to fear anymore. He didn't know what their future would be, but for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about deals or deadlines. He was thinking about mornings with them, about the quiet warmth of their home, about the possibility of a life where love wasn't something he ran from but something he finally stepped toward. And even though neither of them said it aloud, they both felt the shift. Something was changing between them, slowly, cautiously, beautifully. A beginning woven from all the broken pieces of their past, stitched together by a little girl with golden hair and blue eyes who had unknowingly brought them back into each other's orbit. He had never known a year that passed so quickly or changed him so deeply, and by the time early summer settled over the city, the rhythm of their lives had shifted into something steady, almost fragile in its newfound harmony. Every morning began with the quiet shuffle of Scarlett's footsteps as she rushed toward the door to greet him, her hair still messy from sleep, her small hands outstretched as if welcoming the sun itself. A few months ago she had been shy around him, curious but cautious, and now she clung to his neck with complete certainty, as though he had always been part of her world. The transformation was small but profound, a thread of love slowly weaving its way into the spaces between them, drawing all three closer in ways they had not dared to imagine. Aaron felt that change as something almost physical, like a second heartbeat. He adjusted his work schedule without announcing it to anyone, pushing early meetings later so he could take Charlotte to the park in the mornings, something as simple as tying her shoes or watching her choose between two identical ribbons becoming moments he treasured more than any corporate victory he had ever celebrated. His colleagues noticed his absence, his lighter expression, the way he no longer carried the weight of a man who believed his only worth lay in the empire he built. They whispered, speculated, wondered if there was a woman, never suspecting that what changed him was a little girl who had unknowingly brought life back into a man who had forgotten how to feel anything but emptiness. Lillian watched him with caution at first, her trust fragile and bruised from the past, but over time she began to see the same transformation he felt within himself. He never pushed her, never asked for more than she was ready to give. He offered presence instead of promises, consistency instead of declarations. He showed up even on the days she told him she didn't need help, he stayed when things were difficult, and he listened, truly listened, when she spoke about the fears she had tried for years to swallow alone. She told him about the nights she had cried from exhaustion, the panic she felt when Charlotte was sick, the loneliness that sometimes felt like it would drown her. He didn't interrupt or defend himself, he simply let her speak and held the silence with her, acknowledging her pain without running from it. Despite the progress, fear still lived between them like a quiet ghost. There were moments when Lillian felt blindsided by old memories of him standing in that cold apartment 3 years ago, telling her he didn't want children, unaware that the universe had already chosen a different fate for him. Some nights she lay awake wondering if his change was permanent or just temporary redemption. She questioned whether allowing him into their lives more deeply might be a mistake, whether love could really grow again from soil that had once been poisoned by betrayal and fear. But each time doubt tried to pull her backward, something gentle pulled her forward again, like the evening they all cooked dinner together in her small kitchen. Aaron burned the pancakes, Charlotte smeared flour everywhere, and Lillian laughed so hard she had to hold onto the counter to breathe. She hadn't laughed like that in years, and when she caught him watching her with a look of awe, as though seeing her happiness felt like a privilege, she felt something shift inside her. Another moment came when he fell asleep on her couch with Charlotte sprawled across his chest, both breathing in slow, matching rhythms, the rise and fall like a lullaby that filled the room with warmth. She stood beside them, her hand hovering over his shoulder before she gently pulled a blanket over them both. Still, the biggest shift happened quietly one afternoon at the park. Charlotte was running ahead, trying to chase a butterfly, her bright laughter ringing across the field. Aaron and Lillian walked a few steps behind her, speaking softly about small things, her work schedule, his new project, Charlotte's upcoming preschool registration. The conversation flowed naturally, peacefully, without the sharp edges it once carried. At one point the wind carried a strand of Lillian's hair across her face, and without thinking, Aaron reached out to move it behind her ear. The touch was soft, instinctive, unplanned. She froze, not from fear but from the warmth that shot through her, the realization that her heart no longer recoiled from him. Instead of pulling away, she let him continue. Their eyes met, and something fragile but undeniable passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that their story had begun to rewrite itself. There was no kiss, no dramatic confession. Just a brief moment of closeness that felt more intimate than any embrace. It was enough to make Lillian's breath tremble and Aaron's heart trip over itself like a man discovering hope for the first time. That evening, when they walked Charlotte home, Aaron hesitated on the doorstep. Lillian expected him to leave the way he always did, giving her space, respecting her boundaries, but instead he stayed a moment longer. His expression was careful, almost shy. "I don't want to rush anything," he said quietly, his voice lower than usual. "But I want you to know that every time I'm here, it feels right. Not just because of Charlotte. Because of you." She swallowed hard, feeling a warmth bloom in her chest that she had tried to suppress for far too long. "You're different now," she murmured. "Sometimes I'm afraid to believe it." He nodded. "So am I. But I'm here anyway." When he finally turned to leave, she whispered his name so quietly he almost missed it. He looked back, and for the first time she didn't hide her feelings behind steady eyes or guarded silence. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't for a specific thing, more like gratitude for the gentleness he had shown, the persistence, the love that had grown not from desire but from second chances. He didn't answer, but his smile, soft, unguarded, almost reverent, was enough. Inside the house, Lillian sat on the edge of the sofa, feeling the full weight of the moment settle into her heart. She wasn't ready to call it love again, not yet, but she was no longer afraid of the possibility. The past still existed, but it was no longer the only truth. And as summer stretched toward autumn, she knew the door she once closed out of fear was slowly opening, not because he forced it, but because he earned the right to step through it. And this time, she wasn't stepping back. A soft breeze rolled across the Harvest Festival grounds, carrying with it the scent of cinnamon, roasted apples, and warm earth. The late afternoon sun washed everything in amber light, turning ordinary pumpkins into glowing lanterns scattered across the field. Children ran between haystacks, chasing soap bubbles that drifted lazily into the sky, and somewhere nearby someone played a gentle acoustic melody that made the moment feel like something suspended outside of time. Lillian stood at the edge of the field, watching Scarlet dart between rows of pumpkins with a laughter so bright it seemed to warm the air around her. The little girl ran with the boundless joy known only to children, her golden hair catching the light in a way that made her look almost unreal. Lillian felt her heart swell at the sight, still unable to fully grasp that this bright, radiant child was hers, and his. Aaron stood beside her, a few inches closer than usual, not touching her but close enough that she felt the faint presence of his warmth through the fabric of her sweater. He watched Scarlet too, his expression soft and almost awestruck. There was a stillness in him she had never seen before, a quiet peace that had nothing to do with power, achievement, or reputation. It was the peace of a man who finally understood what mattered, who was no longer running from the things that frightened him. Lillian could sense the difference in him in the way he breathed, in the way his shoulders rested without tension, and in the way he allowed himself to simply exist in the moment. He had changed, and not in the shallow, performative way she once feared. This was a shift that had rooted itself deep within him, reshaping him from the core. Scarlet turned suddenly, spotting them standing together, and ran toward them with a little pumpkin clutched triumphantly in her hands. She threw herself into Aaron's arms without hesitation, and he lifted her effortlessly, kissing the top of her head as she proudly announced that she had found the perfect one. He laughed, a warm, unguarded sound that wrapped around Lillian like a soft embrace. It was rare to hear him laugh like that, but in the past months it had become more frequent, as though fatherhood had unlocked a part of him he never knew existed. Lillian watched as he held Scarlet, and she felt something inside her melt, a place she had kept closed for far too long. They found a bench near the edge of the pumpkin patch, and the three of them sat together, sharing a cup of warm cider. Scarlet nestled comfortably between them, her small hands wrapped around the drink while she told a very dramatic story about a giant pumpkin monster she had seen earlier. Aaron listened with full attention, his eyes widening in playful shock at all the right moments, and Lillian felt herself smile at the sight. She rested her elbow on her knee, watching them interact with an ache so tender it was almost painful. This was what she had feared to hope for, what she had once convinced herself would never happen. And yet here they were, three pieces of a life she once believed had shattered beyond repair. Later, as the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, the field grew quieter, families drifting toward the exit. The sky shifted to deep shades of navy and purple, and strings of lights overhead flickered on, casting a soft glow over the festival grounds. Scarlet grew sleepy, leaning against Aaron's shoulder, her eyes blinking slowly. He wrapped one arm around her, securing her close, and Lillian felt her breath hitch at how naturally he held their daughter. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, only instinct, tenderness, and love. When Scarlet finally fell asleep, her small head resting on his chest, Lillian felt something inside her break open completely. She looked at Aaron, and he looked back, and in that moment there was no past, no mistakes, no regrets, only acceptance, forgiveness, and the quiet promise of something real. He shifted slightly to keep Scarlett comfortable, then met Lillian's eyes with a vulnerability she had never seen in him before. There was no arrogance left, no mask of control, no cold distance that once defined him. He was simply a man, flawed, imperfect, but honest. She moved closer until their shoulders touched, and the simple contact sent a warm tremor through her chest. He didn't say anything, and neither did she. Words felt unnecessary, the silence between them was full, rich, and meaningful. Finally she rested her head lightly against his shoulder, letting herself lean into him for the first time in years. His breath caught quietly, and he tilted his head just enough to brush his cheek against her hair. The gesture was tender, reverent, filled with gratitude he didn't know how to express aloud. They sat like that for a long time, holding their daughter between them, watching the last golden sliver of sunlight disappear. Lillian felt safe, not because life was suddenly perfect but because, for the first time since everything fell apart, she believed they could build something lasting from the ruins. She believed that his love wasn't just an apology, it was a choice, a conscious, deliberate choice to stay, to grow, to fight for the family he once didn't know he needed. As the night deepened, he whispered her name so softly it sounded almost like a confession. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze, and before she could speak, he said quietly, "Thank you for giving me another chance." His voice trembled, and she saw tears he refused to let fall. She touched his hand, not as forgiveness, not as surrender, but as a beginning. And in that fragile, beautiful moment, Lillian finally understood, the life she feared was lost forever had simply been waiting to be rebuilt. Not perfectly, not quickly, but honestly. A family born from mistakes, strengthened by pain, and bound by a love that grew slowly, carefully, faithfully. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real.